On my 29th birthday, the chandelier in the dining room threw cheap diamonds across their faces, and everything looked like a photograph someone else had taken. My grandfather laughed first, the way he always did, as if he'd already set the scene in his head, and the rest of us were only actors showing up on cue. "How do you spend your 3 million trust, Theo?" he asked, raising his glass like he was offering a toast and a trap at the same time. The world narrowed to the stem of his glass. I tasted metal. "My name is Theo Gaines. I live in a walk-up in the Mission. I freelance on the side. I paint sometimes when the city gives me a day and clients don't." I had no idea there was supposed to be 3 million with my name written on it. "Trust?" I heard myself say. "What trust fund?" "They planned it for me when I was born," my grandfather said. Like this was a peaceful history lesson. "Your mother and father were the trustees. You were to be given the funds when you turned 25. Michael, the lawyer, slid a folder across the table. Clinical and indifferent. The kind of thing that looks small when bad things hide inside it. "Should be 3 million now," the lawyer said. "As of this morning, the account balance is 200,000. 200,000. The number landed on me like a thrown thing. Not a debt statement, not an awkward silence, but an accusation. The room cooled. My mother's mascara smeared. The first honest thing I saw her do that night. They called it poor decisions, market downturn. Necessary expenses, renovations in the home. The Malibu place was their laughable tiny exception until the desktop printed receipts fanned out like evidence. Car purchases, jewelry, travel. A line that said purchase of property in Malibu, 1.8 million, in the names of James and Eleanor Gaines. My father's face went hollow because it couldn't hold the story he'd been telling himself anymore. My mother cried like she was being taught the shape of grief for the first time. My grandfather's voice was flat when he said there would be an audit. He said the word restitution like it was a thing that could be buttoned onto a life and set. For most of my life, my parents were a performance. They loved the parts they wanted to love. They applauded the versions of me that came in formal wear. Quiet and grateful. I had learned to keep my voice small at their table because big things made them uncomfortable. Student loans. Nights pulling all-nighters to make rent. My father had always had a way of turning my needs into a lesson plan. Here's how to budget. Here's how not to be romantic about life. He gave me a copy of Financial Planning for Young Men at graduation, like it was a present that meant we did our part. That night, the present had been a betrayal wrapped in portfolio returns. My grandfather handed me a set of keys and the word "now" that tasted like an ending. They left, escorted by a kind of shame that looked different on each of their faces. My grandfather said the audit would continue. The law would take care of the rest. But he looked at me like a man who had noticed a crack and decided to set a seam. Outside, the city wasn't the kind to pause for family dramas. Buses hissed. A couple argued about something small on the sidewalk. I held the keys in my pocket like coins of a currency that had been doubled and then stolen. Madison, my roommate, met me in the hallway and looked at me like I had just told her a bad story she couldn't believe. "They took from you," she said. "From you." I wanted to cry for the 37 times I'd swallowed my voice, for the nights of ramen, for the interviews I had gone to where my mother smiled for the camera and not my effort. I thought about the paintings I hadn't been brave enough to sell. I thought, too, about my grandfather's quiet hands. He was old, older than a picture could make him seem, and he had lived with empathy tied to a ledger. He had made the kind of money that keeps people polite and dangerous at the same time. He had a way of looking at you that made you consider the possibility of things beyond your anger. Justice is your choice, he said. That was the thing that landed last. He could pursue them, he said, but he would only do so if I wanted. There was a weight to his asking, because it spelled the options: prosecute and break the family for good, or let time smooth the meat of the thing and go on. He left the decision in my hands like a loaded pen. I took time. I thought, maybe this will pass. Maybe I'll let them keep the Malibu house and take the gentle route. That thought was like swallowing poison in a pretty glass. I couldn't, not because I wanted to watch them suffer. The word revenge sounds mean and childish, but because taking what's yours back is sometimes the only way to stop pretending you are always small. I asked questions I had never been taught to ask. I called the bank and watched a string of numbers on a screen, the kind that make you feel like you're watching small animals scurry in the dark. Withdrawals, transfers, luxury purchases that read like a catalog of someone else's voice. My grandfather's team did a forensic audit, and the numbers began to resolve. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't mismanagement. It was theft. At first I wanted to explode. I wanted to throw plates, to shout in the faces that had once taught me how to keep my mouth polite. That's the cinematic notion, and for a week I practiced it in my head. The truth was quieter and more practical. I didn't want to break them. I wanted to reclaim myself. I wanted a record that said, "You stole from him, and it mattered." Grandpa taught me how to hold anger without letting it rule the room. We began to collect everything: receipts, bills, timestamps, bank transfers. I looked at my mother's emails, how she'd made small offers to herself, and checked boxes with the kind of casual language that made a person seem credible. My father had a line of excuses, a pattern of desperation folded into neat rationalizations. They'd bought the Malibu place the same month mortgage rates dipped, and their name became the title holder. I started to feel the edges of my life come back. Reclaiming wasn't just about money. It was about stopping the old script. My grandfather told me he'd support whatever I wanted to do. He said he was tired of a family that called love accounting. He said, "Go quiet, go legal. I know how to make sure the truth is printed in a way people can't ignore." Madison slept on the couch for the first week after the hearing. I painted again. It was ugly at first, anger in thick strokes, but it was mine. I met with the lawyer. We filed motions that felt like paper bridges, linking the past to a future where I did not have to smile silently at a table while people rearranged my future. There is a temptation to frame revenge as something theatrical, full of late-night plans and whispered conspiracies. The reality is heavy on paperwork and patience, on lawyers who speak to you like you're a case number. On the eve of filing charges, my father called me to the kitchen. He asked me not to. He said he was sorry in ways that tried to sound human. He said we'd do anything to fix it. His voice broke in a place that felt rehearsed. His apology was full of pleas. He said he loved me and that he had made mistakes and couldn't be expected to understand the consequences because he had always had the resources to recover. I listened, and the man who had taught me how to balance checkbooks pleaded like a child. I wanted them to know that choices have faces and receipts. The next morning we filed. The motions took a week to schedule. My grandfather walked into the hearing with me, his posture steady like the last good thing in an old house. I looked at my parents across the room. They were small under the fluorescent lights. Not the way of people who own beaches, but the way of those who have been found out. When the judge read the counts, the words sounded like a small bell. The city has a way of moving on: cars, work, the minor tragedies of living. But in that courtroom, my family could no longer pretend their actions were innocent. That night, I slept in a bed that wasn't the couch. I drank coffee on the balcony and watched fog move like a soft hand over the bay. People often think revenge ends with damage done. But mine felt quieter. It was paperwork, truth, and the inevitable dignity of watching an account finally be reconciled. That night, I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the rest. I thought of possible futures. A studio with light and space. Paintings unpaid but loved. Evenings where I could breathe. I thought of my grandfather and his hands, and the way he had taught me to hold anger without becoming a person defined by it. In the morning, I would go to the lawyer's office and sign another set of papers. There was no victory song yet. There was just the steady method of righting something that had been wronged. I had learned one thing in that first week. Revenge, when it is honest, is not about spectacle. It is about undoing an injustice in the quietest, cleanest way you can. They say the court system moves slowly. In my case, it moved like a patient animal, deliberate and precise. The forensic audit took weeks. Every transaction was a story. Every wire transfer became a stanza. The defense tried, at first, to make everything sound like a tragic comedy. A family drawing on resources during hardship. My grandfather had instincts about people and about money. He also had patience. He sat with the auditors while I sat with the paintings I now had time to make. I watched my parents in depositions, and they sounded small in a way that had nothing to do with their clothes. My mother's answers fell like someone reading a script she'd never had to rehearse before. My father flinched at questions he'd never been asked about accounts and motivations. The attorney who represented my parents tried to soften them into the kind of figures that judges like to pity. The law did not care for pity. It cared for evidence. There was an odd loneliness to being the protagonist of your own life for the first time in years. The people who had guided my childhood, masks that had been alternately warm and cold, became two documents in a file. That was a simple and brutal reality. Madeline kept coming over with coffee and a ridiculous sense of humor that I needed. She made me read articles about forensics like they were stories instead of instructions. She reminded me to eat. At one point, my father said to me, "Eyes raw, we did what we thought best for the family." The phrase had been used as a shield. I answered, and I remember how the words felt like a knife pressed gently into an old scar. You did what you thought best for yourselves. There's a difference. I found an odd solace in small victories. The first time the court ordered a freeze, I felt something like relief. The agents who came to inventory the Malibu house walked slowly through rooms I had once only watched from a distance. I watched them catalog belongings with the impersonal care the law has for objects. My parents watched, too, but theirs was a different gaze, stunned and resentful, as if the world had unexpectedly turned its lights on. There were nights when I wanted nothing more than to go back to my old life. The shabby apartment, the ramen, the way the world had been smaller and my worries had less public eyes. Then I would look at the list of purchases they'd made with my name on it and remember the little humiliations stitched through years. The times my mother praised the wealthy and ignored my promotions. The way my father folded a cookie receipt into a lecture on thrift. The trial was more public than I expected. Word travels. Wealth has a way of making gossip look like commentary. People I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me with shorthand condolences and congratulations. Some called my choice brave. A few called it cruel. There are always two stories. Mine happened to include depositions and counts of financial fraud that were not ambiguous. My grandfather attended every hearing. He sat with a stoicism I could not quite unpick. When we were alone, he'd explain the mechanics of restitution in ways only a man who'd been keeping ledgers since the 70s could. He said, "Money changes hands all the time, Theo. The important thing is where it ends up and who keeps the receipts." In court, the evidence was sharp. The prosecution had prepared a narrative, pattern of withdrawals, transfers into accounts of luxury, purchases under false pretenses. The defense tried to paint it as mismanagement, an argument that smells of desperation when the records are so clear. The judge asked questions that felt like sieves. One by one, the stories fell through. My parents looked at me in the courtroom sometimes, as if they could not understand why I was not crying. I wasn't, because I had spent months collecting proof, and because I had rehearsed the shape of what I knew was right. There is a moment in a trial where everything tilts. For me, it was when the prosecution presented emails my mother had written to a real estate agent, dulled by polite language, but crystalline in intent. The way she had asked for a property under family investment usage. The way she had signed with a different name on the deed transfer form. The court clerk read the lines slowly, and somewhere in the back row, a woman in a coat I didn't recognize whispered, "Shame." When the verdict came down, it felt like a bell tolling. Guilty on counts of fiduciary breach and fraud. The judge pronounced restitution and ordered the Malibu property and other assets to be liquidated to repay what had been taken. There was also a sentence attached, less weighty in years and more public in shame: probation and community service. A few months of monitored supervision to remind them they had not been above the law. They begged. They offered apologies that smelled of calculation. They called me, begging for mercy, saying they'd learned their lesson, promising to move into a motel and start small. There is a logic to considering mercy. Mercy is humane, but mercy without accountability is blank paper. I thought about the nights alone in my drafty apartment, the nights I'd spent explaining away their absence. The law, in its slow way, had named the theft. Restitution would put money back into accounts and my name where it belonged. That was the kind of mercy an honest person could live with. The day we signed the final papers, the Malibu house was sold at a public auction. It felt strange to watch a life that had been built on my money change hands like an object. There were buyers and brokers, and a man who needed a coastal weekend house. I felt no joy. Perhaps I had expected something more cinematic. The truth was quieter. The house was gone, the proceeds redirected, and my grandfather put the last check on the table, like a punctuation mark. Afterward, my parents moved into a motel, and their new life was an exercise in smaller things. Pride had been extracted with interest. When they visited the restitution office to set up payment plans, I watched them, not with glee, but with the stillness of someone who had finally been heard. The court ordered $500 a month as part of restitution. It was a fraction of what had been taken, sure, but it was the law's attempt to make amends without ruining lives beyond repair. In time, the law's decisions stitched things back to balance. My parents paid restitution. They worked small jobs and tried to rebuild a life under a different sort of light. They learned their mistakes publicly and paid for them privately. I bought a small gallery space eventually, a place with high windows and sunlight that made my canvases breathe. I had people over for dinners that were not performances. We spoke honestly. We left silence where it did not serve. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to be your safe harbor, know this: reclaiming your life isn't always about grandeur. It's about saying clearly, that you will not be redefined by other people's choices. It's about paperwork and lawyers and the slow joy of watching the ledger balance in your favor. It's about the first cup of coffee in a kitchen that is finally yours by right, not by accident. It's messy and legal and sometimes painfully ordinary. It is also, when it is honest, the quietest kind of triumph. The last time I saw my parents, I handed them a photograph, a small print of a painting I had done the week after the verdict. It was of a house by the sea, sunlight caught in glass, colors precise and gentle. They looked at it like people who'd been told a truth they couldn't deny. My mother said, "You were always better than us." I said, "Maybe, but everyone is better than the worst choices they make." She cried then, real and ragged, and my father held his face in his hands. I held back nothing and everything. I forgave them in layers, not because they deserved it all at once, but because I wanted myself back unburdened. Justice was served. It tasted like ledger paper and sunlight and the sound of paint drying in a studio that belonged to me. I sometimes think about smaller things. Madison watering my plant, neighbors knocking for a cup of sugar, a postcard from an old client. The life I rebuilt is not perfect. It is quieter, and it belongs to me. That, more than anything, was the revenge I wanted. To keep living, to keep making, and to do it on my own terms.